My apologies, one moment. All right, I'd like to say hello and welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar. Today's topic is legal issues in tribal food safety. This is a second of a two-part series. In this webinar, we will discuss very specific legal issues pertaining to farms and grow fruits and vegetables in the Indian country, and will provide key discussion points to ensure that differences in jurisdiction and authority are identified. We will also assist the tribal producers in identifying key issues that face us as unique producers. This series of food safety webinars is coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The IFAI is also scheduling a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenouspoodandag.com/food-safety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. Those who attend the in-person training events will receive a certificate of completion. The webinar trainings will not receive a certificate. These webinars we are hosting are here to help you better understand the issues and allow you to broaden your knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. Now please look at the handout section of your control panel. You'll find a copy of the slideshow being presented today. You will find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars on our website. That is once again indigenouspoodandag.com/food-safety. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted. We will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. However, you can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the questions feature on the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Aaron Parker. Aaron currently serves as the Research Director and Staff Attorney at the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law, where she supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and analysis of legislative and regulatory issues facing tribal governments, business, and individual producers. Before beginning her work with the initiative, she worked as the staff attorney and research coordinator for the Cobell Commission. It's a national working group convened by the Secretary of the Interior to repair the federal government's Indian Land Trust Management System. She holds both her JD and her LLM in Agricultural and Food Law from the University of Arkansas. All right, we will now pass this over to Aaron.
All right, thank you very much, Christine, and thank you to everyone who has joined us on this Thursday afternoon. It's nice to be with y'all again today to do another round of food safety discussions and all the legal issues in food safety. As Christine mentioned, we're going to be doing a lot of talk about legal issues in food safety today. We're going to, if you were here with us for our last webinar, as this is the second in a series, we talked last time about some general food safety liability principles. And this time we're going to get a little bit more specific. We're going to talk a lot about the Food Safety Modernization Act and what is required if you are subject to the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act. You may be familiar with this law. This is the probably the most sweeping change to our federal regulations on food safety that we've had in about 30 years. And there's some rolling compliance dates associated with that and a whole bunch of different rules associated with it. We're going to be focusing just on the produce rule today. And I'm going to walk you through some of the specifics associated with that. If you've gone over to your control panel and looked at the handout, you will have noted that there are many, many slides associated with today's presentation. I think there's about 120 of them total. We're not going to read through through every single one of those today, but you are able to take that handout from the handout section and keep it for your future reference. And if you have any questions about something that we may cover a little bit quickly today, please reach out to anybody on our team. I'll have my contact information on a slide here at the end of the presentation, and you can see that also at the end of the handout. You can reach out to me via phone or email, or anybody else on our team. We're happy to help puzzle through some of these food safety liability issues, and we do quite a few trainings on food safety as well. You can find the schedule of those on our website that Christine mentioned earlier, indigenousfoodandag.com/food-safety. All of our food safety materials are kind of housed there, so I'll be referencing that every once in a while as we talk through some of these issues today. Basically, what we're doing here is just trying to walk through some of the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act for the produce rule and have you be familiar with those. And here at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how to construct a farm food safety plan as well. So the very first thing that we're going to talk about, you'll see these slides. These slides are put together in conjunction with the Produce Safety Alliance. And these are some of the materials that you will see if you come to one of our in-person trainings on the produce safety rule. As Christine mentioned, this particular webinar is not going to get you that food safety certification that you need if you're subject to the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act, but we are the Native American Outreach Training and Technical Assistance Center here at the initiative, and we're doing trainings on the Food Safety Modernization Act all the time, all around Indian country. And if you have about 10 growers in an area and you're interested in having us come out to do a training, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to get something scheduled to do something in person. But I will dive in now to the Food Safety Modernization Act because we've got a lot of ground to cover today. So as I mentioned, the Food Safety Modernization Act includes many different rules. The one that we will be focusing on here today is bolded here on this slide. That's the produce safety rule. So primarily today, we're going to be talking a lot about on-farm food safety for produce, and specifically for produce that's actually covered by the rule, and that is food that under the law is regularly eaten raw. We're less concerned under the Food Safety Modernization Act about things, produce that is not something that somebody's going to consume raw, because the cooking of the food, if you tuned into our last webinar on general food safety, you know that the cooking of the food is probably going to be a kill step for a lot of those foodborne pathogens, and that can cause illness and disease in human beings. So under the produce safety rule, we're really talking about produce that people are regularly eating raw. If you've paid attention to the news, food safety outbreaks in the last couple of weeks, romaine lettuce has been a big topic. That's a food that's regularly eaten raw and would be an example of a food that is covered by the produce safety rule. In addition to the produce rules, there's a whole bunch of other rules you can see here on this slide. There's rules about human food. That's going to be a lot of your manufacturing and processors that are affected by that rule. The preventative controls for animal food also is a rule under the FSMA that's going to deal with animal feed, obviously. And there are several other things that you can see here listed, including even a Sanitary Transportation Act that deals with how we address food safety and the transportation process of getting food from place to place. There's a little bit of transportation involved here today, and we'll go over that towards the end of the slide. But for the most part, when you see that, you're going to think about the Sanitary Transportation Act being big, large, moving across state lines and that kind of thing. But for today, we're going to dive into this produce safety rule, and that's where we're going to stay. The curriculum that we're using, as I mentioned, is part of the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum. This is going to cover both the FSMA produce safety rule requirements, as well as a lot of things that if you are GAP certified, you might be familiar with a lot of these things, because the good agricultural practices, many of those produce safety practices under GAPs are going to be covered as well by this curriculum. If you are subject to the requirements of the FSMA, there is a requirement for at least one supervisor from your farm to complete food safety training that is equivalent to the standardized curriculum, and the PSA training materials that we're using today satisfy that requirement if you come to an in-person training. So that's why I mentioned, if you've got folks who need to be certified, just let us know and we can come out and do training. If you can gather up at about 10 people, makes a good class size. Today, you will notice that all of the slides that we're going to be going through have this funky little section symbol that arrow is pointing to down here in the lower right-hand corner. In the produce safety materials, this is an indicator to you that something on this slide is a requirement under the FSMA. It's a must. It's not a may, it's a must. So that's mostly what I'm going to be going over with you today are the musts under FSMA. If you're subject to FSMA, then these are the things you must do. So everything today is going to have that funky little symbol down there in the corner. The FSMA, as I mentioned, this is a big shift in how we manage risk for food safety and food safety liability. It's a federal law, so it applies all across the country. It applies to growing, harvesting, packing, holding fresh produce. There are some exemptions. I'm not going to go over those right now, but I will say if you listen to our last presentation, or hopefully after the end of today, what we want to do, I think, is impress upon folks, even if you're not covered under the FSMA right now and you are eligible for an exemption or exclusion based on some of the criteria in the law, everybody who grows food and sells it should understand and take some actions to reduce your food safety risks on the farm. Because even if you don't fall into the FSMA, you definitely still have general food safety liability that we talked about last time that will still apply if you're doing any kind of sales. Just by putting that product into the stream of commerce, that does open you up to some legal risks. So having some food safety practices and documenting those practices is really important. This is the produce safety rule compliance. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but basically it's done by business size, and that's how many years they gave people to comply. So they gave very small businesses up to 4 years to comply with the effective date of the law, and larger businesses only got about 2 years. Record keeping is something that we're going to talk about a lot today, because record keeping is one of the things that is required under the FSMA across all subject matter areas in the FSMA, whether we're talking about agricultural water that's used in production or water that's used post-harvest to clean or sanitize food, whether we're talking about soil amendments or worker health and safety. There's record keeping all over the FSMA that if you are subject to the requirements of the FSMA, you have to keep these records. There are a lot of templates out there that are available to help kind of streamline this process if this isn't something that you've already been doing. And it notes here too, and record keeping should be convenient or it's not going to get done, right? It's just, it's another thing that you need to do, and it needs to be a process that makes sense to you. So there's not a mandated form under the FSMA that you have to use to keep the records that we're going to be talking about today. It just needs to be something that makes sense to you. And it does need to be signed and dated by the farm supervisor after they've been reviewed, and they do need to be kept for 2 years. But outside of that, they can look like a lot of different things, that whatever really makes sense to you. They can be written by hand if pen and paper makes most sense. If you've got somebody who's really good with a cell phone or other kind of handheld mobile piece of technology, those are also good ways to keep records if you want to do it that way and keep everything in the cloud. I know folks who keep a clipboard inside a plastic bag with a pen clip to it so they can have it out in the field and it doesn't get dirty or anything. They've got their records on them. All of those things are perfectly valid ways to keep records, but we are going to talk about records a lot today because there are so many things required under FSMA when it comes to record keeping. This is just kind of a snapshot of what those are. There's much more detail in the handout and the other slides that we're going to go over today about what records must be kept. But just generally speaking, you've got to keep, unless you're exempt from FSMA, you've got to keep records on your worker training programs, worker health. If somebody calls out sick, you've got to document that they were out sick and that they didn't work that day. Hygiene practices, making sure bathrooms are stocked with soap and toilet paper and that kind of thing. When you talk about soil amendments, there are record keeping requirements associated with those under the FSMA. You've got to keep track of where those soil amendments came from, if you're buying them from a third party, rates and dates of application, handling practices, sanitation practices. I talked about water a little bit, just in my example earlier. Water testing results have to be documented under FSMA. And I know this may sound like a lot of record keeping, but I mean, a lot of it may be something that you're kind of already doing anyway. And if you're not, then there are plenty of of templates you can find links to on our website that will help you kind of streamline that process and get into the habit of keeping these records. Because like I put a note here at the end of the slide, even if you're exempt, just putting food into the stream of commerce means you're still subject to general food safety liability. And as we talked about last time, if there is a foodborne illness associated with a food that you might be growing, a good way to prove up pretty quickly that you might not be associated with that foodborne illness outbreak is to have all of these records and have all this documentation. We like to say a lot, I think, when we do these trainings, that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And I know that sounds, they may sound a little harsh, but I think that when in the world of legal liability, that's a good rule of thumb. Just making sure you're writing that down so you have a record of everything that you did, and you can prove that pretty quickly with those records. So we're going to talk a lot about records. But first, we're going to talk about worker health, hygiene, and training. I've tried to go through here and highlight things that are musts on these slides. So what you see here, one of the rules under the FSMA, one of the standout rules is that everybody has to have some kind of training. Not everybody maybe needs to go through the full food safety class and get that certification. Not every single person on your farm will need to do that. I mean, obviously there's a lot of seasonal help on farms, so you're not going to send everybody to a full day training, but you are going to have to send one person, at least one supervisor. That's a must under the law. One person has to have the full training so that that person can then come back and train everybody else, even if they're seasonal. And everybody needs to know generally just how to identify and reduce food safety risks so we reduce the risk of foodborne illness outbreaks. That's kind of the whole goal of the FSMA. And people need to know what they're responsible for doing. They need to know how they report food safety risks, kind of up the chain of command on the farm. If they see something, who to report it to. So those are going to be, that training is going to be a must under the FSMA. I'm going to go through a lot of these things kind of quickly because we do have a lot of ground to cover, but just to highlight, if you do this training, we usually do this training in about 8 hours of a day, and I've got about an hour to kind of walk through real quick a lot of the things that are musts under the FSMA. So if there, like I said at the beginning, if there's something that you have a specific question about, please let me know here at the end. I'm going to try to leave some time for questions, and I will stay on the line as long as y'all want to talk, or if you need to email, that's fine too, or call me later. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff. So just hitting the high points of the musts under the worker health, safety, and hygiene for the FSMA. If you've got visitors on your farm, this applies to things like U-pick or any kind of agritourism. If people have corn mazes or pick your own pumpkin kind of thing on your farm, those are going to be visitors to your farm. Under the FSMA, you do have to make those folks aware of the food safety policies of the farm, and they have to have access to a toilet and hand washing facilities. You can do that awareness sort of thing with a sign, that's fine. But in some way, shape, or form, they got to know where they can and can't be, because you don't want visitors kind of tracking all over the place, because we don't know what they bring with them. When we're talking about training programs for your workers, some of the things that they need to do is, this is what the training program has to include. You have to talk about hygiene, and you have to talk about food safety generally. They have to know how to recognize the symptoms of foodborne illnesses, and they have to know why it's so important to have good personal hygiene for themselves and for every visitor who comes to the farm. And that's a lot of the stuff that we talked about in our first webinar in this series a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about the types of foodborne pathogens that there are, how those are spread. And a lot of that, as you'll remember if you tuned in last time, a lot of these bacteria and viruses are spread through fecal oral contact. So we're going to talk about poop a lot, because we always do when we talk about food safety. It's just those, got to have those good hand washing practices, people not coming to work when they're sick, that kind of thing, because that's inevitably how we kind of spread illness from person to person. And people who are being trained on your farm need to know that. I know it's kind of gross to talk about poop, but you know, you're on a farm. It's a practical reality. Things are going to happen. Wildlife's going to come. Poop is going to happen. People just need to know how to address the issue. There's kind of a catch-all here on this slide, other training relevant to their jobs. That's going to be, the FSMA kind of accounts for the fact that on a farm, people may have multiple jobs and they may do quite a few different things, or there may be people who come on and are seasonal help just to do pretty much one specific kind of job. So there's not a guideline for what that other training is. It's kind of up to you and the supervisor who goes through this food safety training and kind of determine who needs to know what and when. Absolutely, though, that training has to be appropriate for their job, and it needs to be conducted when they're hired, not in the middle of their duties. And sometimes you have to do a refresher. That's another must under the FSMA. If there's some kind of problem that arises, maybe it's time to do kind of a refresher course on food safety. So workers can be qualified to do their jobs under FSMA through a combination of education, training, or experience, and we really lean heavily, I think, on the training and experience here in the Food Safety Modernization Act. I think that's why there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that somebody, again, must, from the farm, a supervisor must be trained so that they can go back and train everybody else. Part of what you're training people to do, again, is just to be able to evaluate the risks that they're going to probably be seeing in their job, whether that if they're picking or harvesting, being able to see animal tracks in the field and know, well, maybe now I need to check and see if an animal has come into the field and defecated in the field. If there's covered produce near that, what do I do? Those are kinds of things that people need to be trained to do under the FSMA. There are also some requirements, and some of these are going to be some overlap with other federal and or state or tribal requirements around occupational health and safety, making sure that you're providing toilets, toilet paper, soap, clean water, paper towels, garbage cans, first aid kits, and break areas. All of those things are going to be required under the Food Safety Modernization Act, because if folks don't have access to those, then we may run into a problem. And I referenced occupational health and safety. This is OSHA. An OSHA requirement is actually one facility, bathroom facility per 20 workers within a quarter mile of the working area. There's a small exemption to that in the FSMA, I believe, if there's a transportation available that can get people to a restroom facility within a reasonable distance, then that's fine as well. But in some form or fashion, folks have to have access to toilets and hand washing facilities. That's a must under the FSMA when it comes to workers. Hand washing is another big must under the FSMA. Hands have to be washed after using the toilet, before starting or returning to work, before and after eating or smoking, again, trying to eliminate that problem of like fecal oral contact. Anytime anybody's going to put on gloves, got to wash their hands first. Anytime anybody touches animals or, of course, animal waste, hands need to be washed. And there's a catch-all here, any other time that hands may become contaminated. So a lot of hand washing, again, under the FSMA, because as we discussed last time, so much of that bad hand washing practices is what contributes to the spread of foodborne illness. This is some more hand washing and around drinking water. We got to make sure that folks have water so they don't, we don't want folks falling out in the fields. That's not good. It's not good for the workers, and it's also a risk of contamination for foodborne illness. So making sure that water is provided and break areas are separate from things like pack sheds and that kind of stuff. All of that is another must under the FSMA. Just generally, people need to be maintaining cleanliness, and that really goes back to a lot of that hand washing, not having jewelry or anything that might get might get dirty. Anytime I'm gonna, like, I think about this. I think about this a lot when I'm at home, and if I make like meatballs or something or meatloaf, like I always take my rings off, because I don't know about any of the rest of y'all. You wear jewelry that has a lot of little grooves in it. You just can't. I don't trust that I can get everything out of there. So those kinds of things need to come off. All of that carries a lot of risk of carrying foodborne illness. So that is another must under the FSMA, to make sure that you're maintaining personal cleanliness, and that's part of it. Proper use of toilets, another must under FSMA, making sure that we're throwing toilet paper into the toilet, not in a garbage can, not on the floor. And again, that hand washing, so vital. Worker clothing, clean clothes, another must. Making sure that we're changing gloves, unless they're, if they're reusable, making sure that they're cleaned. And as I mentioned before, if people are sick, not coming to work and making sure that all of that is documented is really important, because again, this is another way that foodborne illness is spread. And here we come to our record keeping, which I mentioned we're going to talk a lot about today. So what's required, the must for record keeping in worker health, hygiene, training, and safety on the farm is going to be making sure you're documenting that you've done worker training programs, documenting every time toilet facilities are restocked. So like today is the 25th. If you went in and restocked the toilet paper, restocked the soap, make a note on your record form that happened, that those facilities were cleaned and restocked. If there are illnesses, if there are injuries, all of those need to be documented, and so does restocking of first aid kits. So all of those records have to be kept if you are subject to the FSMA. And again, if you're not subject to the FSMA, it's probably a good idea just to make sure that you're maintaining some kind of record around that anyway, because there is still general food safety liability that's going to apply. We'll talk through soil amendments really quickly here. So soil amendments under the FSMA, we're talking about biological soil amendments, especially untreated, like raw manure. Those are the things that are going to pose significant microbial risks and carry significant risks of causing foodborne illness. Chemical soil amendments or synthetics can also impact food safety. It's a less of a risk, but there is still some risk there. And basically, it's just an assessment of risk that's required under the FSMA, depending on the kind of soil amendments that you select. In this area, as well as in the post-harvest water, we're going to talk a lot about kind of conditional musts, so an if-then rule. This is one of those things that's like, well, if you decide to apply this kind of soil amendment, then this rule will be triggered. And if you decide to apply this kind, you might get a different must. So some of this is going to come down to the way that you do things on your individual operation. In any case, human waste is absolutely prohibited. That's a must not under the FSMA. And untreated human waste is not allowed because it may contain pathogens, heavy metals, other contaminants. In addition, they note here, it may not be accepted by produce buyers, which is probably true. There are several other kinds of soil amendments, though, that we need to go over. Pre-consumer vegetative waste is one of those. This is one of those that doesn't have a lot of very strict requirements necessarily associated with it, but they do want you to do some kind of risk assessment with it, because it shouldn't be considered zero risk. There may still be chemical, biological, physical hazards associated with it. Big one, this is non-manure-based soil amendments of animal origin. So your bone meal, your blood meal, feather meal, and fish emulsions. These are things that have to be processed to eliminate pathogens, or you have to consider them untreated biological soil amendments, which means they trigger an entirely different set of rules. And this is a little bit more explanation of what it means to be an untreated soil amendment. That would be anything like raw manure, aged or stacked manure, slurries, manure teas, anything that you mix with raw manure. All of those are untreated, and they carry a very high risk because they haven't been treated to reduce or eliminate pathogens. Composting is another possible soil amendment and treatment. That's a controlled biological process, and if you're doing any kind of composting under the FSMA, there are a couple of validated options that they specifically list, and you can see those here at the bottom. That would be it's aerobic, static, or turned composting. Those are the two kinds that they specifically call out in the FSMA as being validated options. There are specific guidelines that you want to follow in the FSMA for time and temperature that go along with those. I'm not going to go over them today, but just know that they're out there. If that's something that you're doing and you are subject to FSMA, there are some time and temperature things you need to be paying attention to and documenting, of course. Record keeping still a necessity here in the soil amendment land of FSMA. There are also other processes for composting. If you're doing composting, there may be other things. They kind of have a catch-all category, as long as it's scientifically valid and a controlled composting process. So basically, you have data supporting that it's low risk, or that you've been able to mitigate risk through some kind of kill step, or through time and temperature, or other method of reducing pathogens. That can be another valid option under the FSMA. When it comes to application intervals for soil amendments, they don't have any for raw manure currently. They're doing some more research on that, so this is kind of a stay tuned. But there is a 0-day application interval for compost that's treated by a scientifically validated process. That's a must. So this is one of those conditional rules, and if then. And in any case, if you're using an untreated soil amendment like raw manure, you cannot directly apply it to a harvestable portion of a covered produce under the FSMA. That's a must as well. When it comes to handling, one of the musts under the FSMA is to develop some standard operating procedures around cleaning and sanitizing equipment. We're going to go into great detail about cleaning and sanitizing here in a few slides, so I'll go over that then, but keep that in mind. You really need to, under the FSMA, develop those standard operating procedures and also document that they've been followed when you're talking about soil amendments, and that includes any equipment or tools that contact both those soil amendments and fresh produce that is covered by the rule. When it comes to storing soil amendments, FSMA does also have some requirements there. Any biological amendment of animal origin has to be handled, conveyed, and stored in a manner that is contemplated in a way that it doesn't make that become a potential source of conversation. That's really the must when it comes to storing soil amendments. They make some recommendations here on the rest of the slide. These are just kind of examples. You don't necessarily have to do the covering piles or building berms to prevent runoff. But those are some good recommendations that are kind of tried and true as far as FDA is concerned under the FSMA, to do things like minimizing runoff and reducing contamination to crops and water sources through soil amendments. So those are just kind of some suggestions. If you have a different way that complies with the rule and make sure that you're not letting that soil amendment become a potential source of contamination, then you've met the requirements of the rule. And here we find ourselves in record keeping again. Just like in our previous section with worker health, you've got to make sure that you are keeping records on soil amendments, making sure you're noting the type of soil amendment you're using, the source of it, especially if it's from a third party, your rates and dates of application, and all of those handling and sanitation practices, those standard operating procedures that you use to reduce risk of contamination to produce that's covered under the rule. Again, I mentioned composting is going to come with some time and temperature and other processing steps. So just keep that in mind if that's something that you're doing. There's more details in the Food Safety Modernization Act. Soil amendments that are supplied by a third party, again, I mentioned documentation is going to be associated with that for sure. You want to keep, under the FSMA, you need to keep the name and address of the supplier, what soil amendments have been purchased, when it was purchased, how much was purchased, and if there's any kind of lot information or anything like that on the package, that information should be kept as well. This is one of those areas where I feel like if you're doing any kind of electronic record keeping, just taking a picture of that lot information and being able to store that can be a really quick way to make sure that you're keeping up with that particular aspect of record keeping. But again, doing it by hand, also totally valid. It's up to you just to keep the records the way that it makes most sense to you, but in any case, that documentation does need to be kept. So moving on to wild animals and also domesticated animals on a farm. We talked about this a little bit last time, just the kinds of human pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella or Listeria that can be carried by animals, and spreading those pathogens by depositing feces in fields or pooping in the fields, and spreading fecal contamination as they move through fields. Obviously, animals are going to be very difficult to control. Basically, what FSMA is requiring here, it's not the FSMA doesn't say you can't have animals on your farm, because that would be impossible. It's a farm. Of course, there are going to be animals. There are going to be birds flying over, deer, raccoons, plus domesticated animals that folks actually use to work on the farm. And FSMA does contemplate that. It understands that. So the requirement is not no animals. The requirement is, if you're subject to the rule, you got to take steps to reduce risks. And we'll go over some of those now. Wildlife on the farm, again, FSMA is going to require, if there's a reasonable probability that you're going to have animal intrusion, and that intrusion of animals will contaminate covered produce, then FSMA wants you to do two things in terms of monitoring, for sure. You need to monitor during the growing season, all throughout, and really immediately prior to harvest. Basically, we're looking for animal poop in fields on covered produce that would contaminate it. That's kind of the big one under FSMA for wildlife. It's just making sure you're doing an assessment as food is being grown, and then right before harvest to see what risks might be out there. And if you find animal poop in your fields, then you kind of have to make some decisions around management practices, and any kind of corrective actions that you can take to keep that contamination from being put into the marketplace. You definitely don't want to sell contaminated produce. That's a no under FSMA. So during the growing season, they're asking, doing things like monitoring for feces, monitoring for evidence of animal intrusion, being able to evaluate the risk of contamination. And that may look a lot different if you've got a tree crop like pecans, for example, versus a root crop that's actually growing in the ground and might be actually there with the poop. Those are going to be different things that you're going to take into account. And then immediately prior to harvest is one of the big ones, just making sure, looking around, seeing if there's been animal activity and assessing your risks at that point, deciding if there's a portion of the crop that can be safely harvested, if you need to maybe build some kind of buffer zone around it when you're harvesting, if something's been contaminated. All of those assessments are things that you have to do under the FSMA. Domesticated animals, it's a similar sort of process. They want you to be aware and make your workers aware that there are cross-contamination risks sometimes from handling animals and then going out into the field. I think a good example is if I was on a small farm up in Minnesota a couple of years ago, and we did a farm tour, and one of their standard operating procedures, because they had fresh produce in one section and they also had specialty chickens, their procedure for doing tours on the farm was that you went through the produce field first and you ended with the chickens, so that you as a visitor weren't taking potential chicken poop and contaminating the produce fields. So that's kind of a risk assessment I think you would do if you have domesticated animals on your farm, if there are dogs that you have in your fields that are keeping wildlife away, that kind of thing. Just making sure that you and your workers are aware of standard operating procedures for how to deal with it if the dog defecates in the field. That's just a plan that you're supposed to have under the FSMA. And being able to do that risk assessment is really important. Again, assessing risks before planting, also important. This is one of those things that's going to help you make a food safety plan, to be able to think about, like, do I have a landfill up above me? Do I have a CAFO up above me? Is there going to be manure running off into my produce fields? Being able to know where your risks are, even if they're not coming from anything that's on your farm, is another important part of the risk assessment process. And that's definitely true with working animals. Also, as I mentioned, just having those standard operating procedures to know what happens if the animal poops in the field or anywhere near covered produce, making sure that workers know what to do and how those standard operating procedures work, and making sure that they know to, especially one of them probably needs to be, wash your hands after you deal with any of that. The pre-harvest assessment, again, is a must under the FSMA, making sure that there's no fecal contamination present. The arrow in this picture here is pointing to a buffer zone. This is somebody who has, they're growing lettuce down here. That's going to be covered produce under the FSMA because it is something that's regularly eaten raw. It's something that you're going to want to make sure that you do a risk assessment for. Then this person has found some kind of risk and has created a buffer zone around this crop because they don't want to harvest contaminated produce. So that's just part of a risk assessment under the FSMA. If there's contamination, a must under the FSMA is to take a corrective action. The FSMA doesn't suggest exactly what that corrective action might be. It kind of lets you make a decision as a producer, since you're the person there on the farm. But there are some documentation requirements associated with that, just like everywhere else, making sure you record any kind of corrective actions that are taken, what the problem was and how you solved it, basically is what you need to be writing down there. And this is why worker training is so important, and why it's important to document worker training, since you can't be everywhere. The workers on your farm are kind of your front line of defense against these kinds of things. So just one more quick note about record keeping. Got to keep notes for worker training. Got to keep notes for all of your pre-planting assessments, the monitoring that you do for animal activity, any kind of corrective action you had to take. And pre-harvest risk assessments, as well as intrusion or contamination events. Water is a big one. The big must under FSMA for agricultural water, and agricultural water is water that's going to touch covered produce. All of that kind of water has to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. That's the big must under FSMA. There's some specific requirements associated with that. I'm not going to go through every single one in detail because a lot of this has to do with testing. The big must here is keeping water sources free of debris, free of trash, free of domesticated animals and feces and other hazards. Water has to be safe at all times, and if you find that your water is not safe, you have to immediately discontinue its use under FSMA. Testing under FSMA, testing water is the only way to actually evaluate microbial quality. The FSMA does require, if anybody's using an untreated water source, so that's surface or groundwater, and then applying that water through direct application, then it's a must under FSMA to do an initial water quality profile for that water source. That's a requirement. And what that profile is supposed to do is help you understand the quality of your water, understand appropriate uses for it, and determine if you need to take any kind of corrective action. Under FSMA, the must indicator species is going to be E. coli. That is the indicator of fecal contamination. That has to be the measure that's used. That has to be the indicator species under FSMA. Nothing else can be used. It has to be E. coli. All sources of production water under FSMA have to be tested to evaluate whether or not the water quality profile actually meets the criteria that's been established under the FSMA. So there's some specific E. coli parts per 100 milliliters of water that have to be met here. I'm going to speed through some of the requirements for water sources because we still have a ton to cover. But just know that depending on the type of water you're using, there may be different profile samples that need to be taken, and the timing of those samples may have to be more or less depending on where the water comes from. Also know that the dates for compliance on this particular section, on the water section, FDA is kind of rethinking some of the water stuff, so this is one of those stay tuned things. But just generally speaking, those are the musts. Know that water has to be safe and adequate, and that they are thinking through how to make sure that that's so. There are some requirements for exactly how you collect samples of water. Even no matter the water source, has to be used in a sterile bottle, for example. Can't be rinsed before sampling. Basically, just following laboratory instructions here is a requirement under the FSMA. And the FSMA also is going to require that the lab is certified by state and local environmental agencies or third-party accreditors to be able to do that kind of testing. As always, corrective measures may be necessary if water quality doesn't meet the criteria that have been established. And a specific instance of corrective actions may be being needed. It's a must under FSMA to take to take measures to reduce potential contamination from pooled water, and that can occur from any variety of reasons. There's some examples here. All three of these things, a broken emitter, a mistake, or a flood event, all of this would necessitate a corrective action under FSMA. And of course, anytime there's a corrective action taken, no matter what it is, documentation of that is going to be required. Keeping those records again. If you are using any kind of chemical to treat water, this is one of those if-then. You're not always required to keep or to treat water, but if you do, it has to be registered with the EPA and it has to be used as it's intended on the label. All of that is required, and keeping records of it, of course. So here we are, record keeping again, making sure we're keeping all of those water quality test results, monitoring water treatments. If you have to take corrective measures, all of those things have to be documented. Continuing through water, now we're in post-harvest water. So this is going to be probably you're cleaning what you've harvested. This is a place where there can be there's very little margin of error in terms of the water quality. There can be no E. coli in 100 milliliters of post-harvest water, absolutely none. That's a must under FSMA. And you have to know also your initial water quality and intended use, and you have to know if you're using an antimicrobial product or other sanitizer mixed in with your wash water, you have to know how your water interacts with that. And there are some details around that in terms of temperature and time that we will go over here in the next couple of slides. As I mentioned, no E. coli whatsoever. Again, got to treat and test water here in the post-harvest world. Can't have it, just can't harp on this enough. No detectable E. coli in a sample for post-harvest water. You're going to see that a lot in these slides. No E. coli, no for post-harvest water. So a couple of the things that you need to monitor if you are adding any kind of sanitizer to your water under the FSMA. If you decide to add a sanitizer, you're not required to, but if you decide to, you have to monitor that treatment, make records of what treatments you're using, and make sure that you are addressing anything that might affect the efficacy of your sanitizers. So for chlorine, for example, the water pH matters quite a bit when you're using chlorine in wash water. If you have a pH that's out of whack, or if the water is too hot, the chlorine can off gas, which will not only be ineffective as a kill step for any kind of foodborne pathogens, but it will also gas out your workers, which is not good. So you've got to, if you decide to use a sanitizer, that's why the FSMA is going to require that you have to monitor temperature of your water to minimize any kind of risk, and to monitor the pH of your water. Also, you're supposed to visually monitor water for buildup of organic matter under the FSMA. As you're if you're looking at your wash water, there's this picture here. Starting out over there on the left, the low turbidity is fine, but as you move over, you can just visually see there's a lot of organic matter in that one to the far right. So what the FSMA wants you to do is visually monitor that and make decisions about when you need to change that wash water. There's some requirements around wastewater as well. When you're disposing of produce washing water, it needs to be disposed of. So of course it doesn't serve as more contamination to covered produce, so can't dump it out into the field, that kind of thing. Again, if you do decide to use a product as a sanitizer, making sure you're following the label and making sure that it's EPA regulated is really important under the FSMA. And of course, keeping records. Once more, we find ourselves in record keeping. We're almost to a food safety plan, but we're going to walk through worker training again really fast. We talked about worker training earlier in terms of worker health, safety, and hygiene, and specifically for worker training in harvest and post-harvest practices. The must here is that workers cannot ever harvest produce that's destined for a fresh market that's been contaminated with feces, and can never harvest or distribute dropped produce. And so training practices need to make sure that workers are aware of things like that. In terms of workers in pack sheds or packing areas, there are a lot of different kinds of packing areas, but regardless of what it is, if covered produce is being packed there, your food contact surfaces, any surface in the whole place that the food might come in contact with, if that food is covered, they have to be cleaned and sanitized. That's a rule under the FSMA. Direct food contact surfaces are of biggest concern, obviously, because if they're contaminated, then produce can be cross-contaminated. So inspecting, maintaining, cleaning, and sanitizing those surfaces is a must here. I'm not going to go through in great detail all of the cleaning and sanitizing slides, but I did want to highlight there's a difference between cleaning and sanitizing. You clean first and then you sanitize. And I think a good example of this is probably if you have any kind of animals, like if you're on a ranch and you step in a big cow patty, and you could dump a whole bunch of Lysol on your boot and it would be sanitized, but it would not be clean. So you have to scrub off all of that gross stuff first and then go through with the sanitizer afterwards. So it's always clean first, then sanitize if you need to do that with a food contact surface or any other piece of equipment on the farm. Obviously, in a best case scenario, every piece of equipment would be non-toxic and would be durable and would be easy to access, all of those kinds of things. But we know that that's not always possible on a farm, and the FSMA knows that as well. So all hope is not lost if you have older equipment or wooden equipment that's not as easy to clean or sanitize. Just maybe you need to establish some more rigid cleaning schedules, but those are not banned under the FSMA. It just requires you to keep things clean, keep things sanitized if they are food contact surfaces. Same thing goes for retrofitting equipment. Obviously, just being able to go through and kind of, in terms of a food safety plan, identifying places if you've retrofitted something that are gonna maybe cause more of a problem for cleaning, double checking those things might be a thing that you do, but it's not necessarily banned under the FSMA. It's just a watch out for this. Again, training workers so they know to identify these kinds of risks and help prevent contamination in your pack areas or anywhere else on the farm is really important. When it comes to actual packing, only new or single-use containers or things that have been cleaned and sanitized to be reused should be used to pack produce under the FSMA. Pest maintenance is also really important. Pest maintenance plans should take into account your particular risks in your particular area and how you deal with those. They're going to be different for everybody probably. When it comes to cold storage, if that's something you have, cold and cooling is not a requirement under the FSMA, but if you do decide to do it, then they want you to make sure that your instruments that you're using to measure temperature, any kind of thermometer, is maintained and accurate and precise. That's going to be a requirement if you do decide to do cooling. And no condensation or dripping on covered produce can ever happen either. Ice and ice slurries is another thing that's not required, but if you do decide to use it, it does have some requirements, namely that water has to be free again of any E. coli in 100 milliliters of water. So more testing for that. Transportation vehicles just have to be clean before they're hauling produce. So if it's been out in the field and it had got poop or anything on it, making sure that's cleaned before it goes to take food to the farmer's market for sale is really important. And again, record keeping, making sure that you're keeping all of those records. All of those things are going to be required under the FSMA. So if you, any kind of post-harvest handling tools and sanitation, cleaning schedules for those need to be recorded. So I'll go through how to do a food safety plan real fast. There are plenty of templates out there in the world that will kind of walk you through some of this. Just generally speaking, you're going to want to have a plan that has your full farm name and address, a description of what's grown there, how big it is. The farm food safety manager should be identified. And really what a farm food safety plan is going to be is a risk assessment of everything that might impact food safety on your farm, a lot of which we've kind of walked through as we've talked today. Some other things that you might think about including are maps of the farm, any kind of standard operating procedures that you have written out, training records of employees, your agricultural water test results, all of the things that are here, other items that you might think about including in a farm food safety plan. And that's I will note, a farm food safety plan is not required by the Food Safety Modernization Act, but many of these records are a specific requirement. So for example, training records and agricultural water test results, those are going to be required under the FSMA. Tapping a food safety person is probably a good idea, and along with that farm food safety plan, that's the person who's going to have the food safety training, have the experience, help do the risk assessment and develop the plan, and also have the authority maybe to take corrective actions, be the contact person if anything, if any training needs to happen for new employees. Just having a person that you can kind of rely on to be that, be in charge of food safety is important. So before, I know we've gone through this really, really quickly, but we did refer to a lot of federal law today, mostly the Food Safety Modernization Act, but in terms of general liability, know that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is also out there that has some specific requirements and standards around foods. And states, localities, and tribes also have food laws that may have an impact here. And that's a lot of what we talked about last time in the first webinar in this series, talking about putting a product into the stream of commerce and having that general food safety liability. It is strict liability. That's out there regardless of whether or not you're covered by the FSMA. We talked a lot about the two things that are bolded here on the slide today, especially maintaining records. Even in the absence of needing to comply with the FSMA, maintaining those records is a really good way to help manage and limit your legal risk, your exposure to risk, and your liability. I'm going to skip through some of this, but I did want to note, there may be, depending on where you're growing and what you're growing and where you're selling it, there may be different laws at issue. There may be federal, state, local, and tribal level laws. It just depends on your particular locality and what you're growing. But that's an important part of your legal risk assessment, is to kind of be aware of those things. The reason that we harp on records so much is because if there is a foodborne illness outbreak, it is entirely possible that folks can be visited by inspectors. And one of the ways that you can prove your compliance with food safety practices is to have them documented. It may also help you if you have pretty detailed records. If there is a product recall that you might have a product implicated in, being able to know all of your lot numbers and everything, know where it's been sold, might help you avoid being implicated even in a recall. And these are just some things to think about as you think about managing your legal risk, just generally. So if you are developing a farm food safety plan and you are thinking about managing your legal risk for food products, these are some questions to kind of, I think, get you started on those kinds of things. And particularly here when it comes to the FSMA in Indian country, we get a lot of questions around like traditional foods and protections for those or requirements for those under the FSMA. And just generally speaking, if your tribal government has rules in place, laws in place, their own food safety systems in place, they may qualify to receive a variance from the FSMA, from FDA, but the first requirement for that is that your tribe has food safety laws on the books. That'll be the first thing there. But variances are possible. So if that's of interest, please let us know. Part of what we're doing here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative is writing a model food and agriculture code for tribes that should be available later this year. And hopefully that can help maybe lift some of the writing of food safety laws off of folks if they want to use that as kind of a template or a guideline. So we're working on that, and we're happy to talk about that with anyone. Also, we talked a lot about training today. Just as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are scheduling grower trainings for 2018 right now. So if you are subject to the requirements of the FSMA, or you think you might be, or you just want to know more or get a certification, we are happy to come out and do a full day grower training, do the whole full day instead of trying to pack everything into 1 hour. We are happy to come out and do that as part of our role as the Native Outreach Training, Technical Assistance, and Education Center for FDA FSMA compliance in Indian Country. This is a pretty new role, so there may not be a specific answer to a specific question, but we can absolutely help you find the answer and stay in touch and make sure that your questions are answered and that you understand what you're required to do under the FSMA. All of those trainings we provide curriculum at no cost. So please, if you're thinking about it, if you're interested, reach out to our team so that we can schedule a training with you. And I think, well, I didn't leave as much time before 5 for questions as I wanted to, but we did go through all of the slides. That's good. I am here for questions if anybody has them. You can use your control panel to submit questions. You will see a questions feature. I'm going to let, Christine, I'm going to let you drive for a little bit in case there are any questions. So I hope that as quickly as we went through that, I know there may be more questions. Please let me know if there are. And if it's something you're concerned about because you don't want to, I know sometimes liability questions can be a little bit personal. So if you feel more comfortable emailing or calling me later, that's also totally fine.
All right, thank you, Erin. And as Erin said, the questions feature is on your control panel. Feel free to submit any questions you have. We'd also like to remind you that you can get more information at www.indigenousfoodandag.com. To go specifically to our website, it is /food-safety. There you can get more information about previous webinars, upcoming webinars, get printouts from the handouts that are provided in the webinars. So once again, we'd like to thank Erin, and if we have any questions come through, we will address them. Let's see. All right, Erin, I'm going to give them just another minute in case anyone's typing.
Sure.
Do you have any last-minute comments or suggestions or anything you might want to make?
No, other than just to reiterate that we are absolutely here to do grower trainings for anybody who's interested. We're happy to come out. You can email me. You can also reach out to Sandy Martini on our team, who's our grower training coordinator. And we are absolutely happy to come out and do that.
All right. Well, I'd also like to remind y'all, please visit the website. You can see a calendar of our upcoming webinars. I'm sure there will be some interesting topics you'll want to participate in. And thank you all for joining us. We will see you at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.